And I did want to let everyone know that because we are recording, if you do not want to appear on today's video, please make sure that you have your video shut off so that you do not appear in the background of the video. Also, please make sure that you are on mute. I understand that a lot of you are working remotely and family being what it is. I understand that completely. My 4-year-old is probably going off in the background or will at some point. Evaluation, a link to the evaluation will be posted in the chat box after the presentation or near the end of the presentation. That is also how you will get a copy of today's certificate. So please make sure that you click on the link and take today's evaluation. After the presentation, we will be making available a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as a copy of the recording. The recording will also be posted on the Families Together in New York State website and the Northern Regional Center for Independent Living YouTube page. We will be sending out that information shortly after the end of the presentation. Throughout the presentation, we do want this to be interactive. So if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to type those questions into the chat box. Myself and Sue and Kathleen will be moderating the chat box. So we will try to answer those questions along the way, and we will jump in from time to time to ask those questions of our presenter as needed. And Cicily will be taking question breaks along the way. Again, please make sure that you are on mute so that we do not have a lot of background noise. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Kathleen Liedtke to introduce today's presenter, Cicily. So please take it away, Kathleen.
Thank you, Jen. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to see that we've got so much participation for this amazing presentation by Cicily. I'm going to, again, just repeat what Jen said. Please make sure that you're on mute throughout the presentation so that everyone has the opportunity to hear this presentation clearly. We wanted to let you know that this is being brought to you by Families Together in New York State. And that we are so grateful to have Jennifer from Northern Regional Center for Independent Living, who has done a lot of the background for us on this and did such a beautiful introduction with the housekeeping. So we are going to have Cicily introduce herself to you. And so at this time, I'd like to introduce you to Cicily, who's going to bring us this amazing presentation this morning.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Cicily Talerico, and today we're going to talk about changing your perspective by applying a trauma-informed lens. I just want to start off by thanking Sue Lewis, Kathleen Liedtke, and Jennifer here. They work around the clock to bring these presentations to everybody. And thank you to Families Together in New York for hosting me today. I wanted to start off by saying I'm an occupational therapist by trade. I've been working with children and family and people for 20 years. And you may be wondering why an occupational therapist is presenting a presentation on trauma-informed care. But through my years of working with children, oftentimes they get sent for an occupational therapy evaluation because of sensory processing difficulties or sensory processing disorder. I worked with a lot of families along the way, but when I took a different position working inside a children's acute psychiatric center, you know, most of the younger children I worked with had some type of sensory processing difficulties. But there was just this missing piece. It wasn't a typical sensory processing difficulty. There were other pieces. There was difficulties with learning, difficulties with memory, you know, the difficulties with the processing. And, you know, and when I first started working there, I was talking to the nurse and I said, I just can't quite put this together? I said, and she goes, yeah, there's a name for this. And she goes, it's complex trauma. And, you know, and she gave me all this, all these papers and things to look at and research books. And I thought, oh my goodness, this was a piece that I was missing in my sessions with treating children and families. And ever since that day, you know, I've been reading about trauma-informed care, taking continuing education, applying trauma-informed care practices into my practice, not with just children, but with adults. So that's why I'm here today, because it really changed my lens, my view of the children and families that I worked with. So what we're going to do today is we're taking a very, very large topic and we are putting it into 2 hours. So, all right, there we go. All righty. So what my goal is for today is that we're going to start off by talking about how trauma affects the brain. And then we're going to talk about the neurodevelopment and how trauma as a child and as a teenager adult, we're going to look at how that affects our brain and our behavior. And then we're going to learn how to apply a trauma-informed lens. And then towards the end, we are going to look at what are some practices in treating trauma. What we're going to do along the way today, too, is that we will stop for questions, discussion. You know, as a reminder, we do only have 2 hours today, and any questions or discussions that we don't answer, maybe we can bring this back in the future. All right, so, oh, was there okay, can you hear me now? I was muted for a second. All right, so we're going to start off. What are the effects of children who experience early adversity? Sorry, trying to move on here. All right, so let's start off with just some statistics. This is in 2016, but there were 676,000 victims of abuse and neglect, and that's just what was reported. This is from the CDC. You know, they've estimated that 1 in 4 children experience some form of child abuse or neglect, and that 1 in 7 children may have experienced abuse or neglect in the last year. As most of us know, children, people in general living in poverty, they tend to experience more abuse or neglect. And that children that live in poverty are 5 times higher than others to have abuse and neglect in their home. In 2019, it was reported that 1,840 children died of abuse and neglect in the United States. All right, and that it's very, very costly. You know, these children oftentimes grow up into adults that end up maybe in jail in the juvenile systems. You know, so it's very, very costly that the effects that trauma have over a lifetime. All right, so let's take a look. Let's talk about PTSD versus complex trauma. I can't see the chat box right now, but what does PTSD mean to you when you hear that word? Who do you think of when you hear PTSD? I'm going to try to find my chat here. I can see it. Ah, there we go. Yes, veterans, absolutely. That's who I always think about too when I hear PTSD. Yep, rape victims, yes. Domestic violence, absolutely. Sexual assault. So let's look at that for a second. All right. All right, so PTSD, we oftentimes hear that when we're working with adults, like it was just come up, veterans, people that have maybe had rape, domestic violence, something that happened, an experience in their life, and it's or witnessing some type of event. All right. So a lot of times we hear like combat or a natural disaster, car accident, sexual assault, the traumas from war. Oftentimes it could even happen after just one event. It could be more than one. And the symptoms last more than 6 months. So now I'm going to ask in the chat again, complex trauma. Has anyone heard of it? What do you think about when you hear complex trauma? Yes, built up over years, multiple trauma. Yep, exactly, Kayleen. Several different types of trauma. Yes, multiple layers. Oh, I like that. Yep, re-traumatization, re-victimization, absolutely. So trauma over time. So we're gonna talk for a second about complex trauma. I am going to talk a little bit here about Dr. von der Klock. He may be partially retired at this point in time, but he really coined the term complex trauma and developmental trauma disorder. But it's something that you guys just talked about. It's an experience over time, multiple experiences. And somebody said layers. That's a great way of saying this. It's layers of chronic and prolonged types of trauma. But the one thing it's early onset. So this is complex trauma is trauma as a child, infant, toddler, school age, because it has an early life onset. All right. This is just a little picture that I've used. So, looking in the middle where it says complex trauma, that's like the child at this point. They can experience one or many of these factors, such as we talked about: sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, especially towards their mothers in the home. They can be emotionally abused, but they can also be emotionally neglected. And then that comes with an educational neglect. Their physical and mental health are also neglected. They don't go to the doctors. Poverty should actually be up here in this circle. We all know that people living in poverty, they don't have access to good nutrition. They don't have access to health care. And that is part of this complex trauma disorder here. All right, I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but next, I just want to talk a little bit about developmental trauma disorder. Okay. Don't mind my notes here. So developmental trauma disorder, you're not going to find it in the DSM-5. This is essentially the operational definition by Dr. von der Klock and his team. In 2005, the Complex Trauma Task Force was chaired by Dr. von der Klock and his team. And they began working on constructing this new diagnosis, which is developmental trauma disorder. And they were hoping to get it into the DSM-5 at that time. But unfortunately, the DSM-5 suggested that they continue with their research. So hopefully when the DSM-6 comes around, it will be through the research that has been taken over the last 15 years. I hope that this gets put into a disorder. Sometimes you will see this written, developmental trauma disorder, complex trauma disorder, or you'll see PTSD as a child. But, some of you might be aware of sensory processing disorder. And just a little side note is that sensory processing disorder was also slated to try to get into the DSM-5 during this time also. And that was also suggested that there needs to be more research. So it's difficult when you have these multiple, I'm going to keep using that word, thank you, these multiple layers of trauma, because people all react differently. And that's why we're going to talk about the brain and neurodevelopment in the next bit of this. All right, so we're going to talk about now how, any questions quickly up in the chat box that I need to stop and talk about.
So far, it doesn't look like we have any questions, Cicely, so I think you're good to go.
Okay. All right, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk about how does complex trauma affect the brain and our bodies. So this is really the first piece of understanding behavior, because that's, you know, as clinicians, as parents, as advocates, as people working with people, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see behaviors, and then we're going to apply judgments to the behaviors that we see. So what I'm trying to do today is educate and let's investigate some of the behaviors. So maybe we can change how we're judging them. Auditory process, I'm going to answer this question real quickly and then I'm going to move on. Auditory processing disorder, I have to be honest with you, I don't know if it's in the DSM-5. I haven't personally looked that up, but auditory processing can be often talked about during sensory processing disorder. These are all brain-based neurological types of disorder, and it can be a learning disability. So if you're looking for, you know, a child that's in school and you need a 504 plan, per se, you can often use auditory processing disorder. I don't know if that helped with the question, but all right, let's talk about, we're going to move on. We're going to look at the brain for a minute. We're going to go back to some neuroanatomy when I get my, there we are. Okay, so in order to talk about trauma, we're going to take a look at how the brain works at first, and then we're going to go back and we're going to see how this trauma can affect the brain development. In our forebrain here, in our cortex, the front lobe, all right, that's where all of our executive functioning happens. That's where our intelligence, our personality, our motor and sensory functions, our planning, our organization, and that's where a lot of our language processing happens. So essentially, that's what makes us different than animals, is that we have this large frontal cortex, and that helps us with all of our executive functioning. All right. In the middle of the brain here, you're going to see our limbic system. Okay. Our limbic system has the amygdala. If you haven't heard the amygdala before, that is our organ that is responsible for our fear and our conditioning. And it also associates learning of a person's perceived fear. The cingulate gyrus, it's a fold in the brain. It's involved in sensory input, and it helps regulate our emotions and our aggressive behavior. All right, this is all here in the limbic system. Let's see. Our amygdala, we just talked about, that's our emotional responses to stress. Then we're going to talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, that, if you haven't heard of that, that helps regulate our adrenaline, our epinephrine. It stimulates our hormones. It helps put us into a sympathetic or parasympathetic response. Okay, our hippocampus, that is our memory. It helps us retrieve and store memory. I'll talk about, I had a little girl, her memory was grossly affected by her horrific trauma. And, you know, even like one day I said, well, we're going to pass snack out today. And she's like, well, I can't remember who gets what. It was very, you know, she had a real difficult time in school because of her severe complex trauma history really affected her memory center. And then in our lower part of the brain here, that's our brainstem. You know, that's vital for all of our body functions. So that's our heart rate, our breathing, our sleeping patterns, you know, our eating when we're hungry. And that the brainstem also relays all the information back and forth throughout our body. So that's how our brain works. And now we're going to look at, so what happens when somebody has complex trauma? All right, this is parts of how it's going to affect our brain. All right, our thinking center, it's going to be affected, and we're going to learn why after these few slides, our neurodevelopment. All right, it becomes underactive. A lot of children, especially once they get into school, are really going to have some learning difficulties because that their thinking center, their cortex, they're going to have some executive dysfunction. Another part of the brain here is our self-regulation center, that cingulate, where I said that that helps with regulation of emotions, and it helps with regulating our aggressiveness. This other section here, this interoception center becomes dysregulated. I encourage anybody after this, if you don't know what interoception is, look it up. You'll be surprised at how many, if you've ever worked with children that have sensory processing disorder or children on the spectrum, you're gonna probably realize that they have some difficulties with their interoception center. And essentially that center, it helps us feel what's going on inside of our bodies. That is essentially, that goes to all of our body organs. You ever work with the kids that have to go to the bathroom and they have to go right now, right away? That's because they don't have that good interoception to know, you know, to get ready. I might have to go to the bathroom, but I could wait 15 more minutes. They don't know, you know, they have difficulty saying that they're full or hungry. A lot of people that use food as a reward for themselves, a lot of times they don't regulate their body temperature well. All right. Our memory center, our hippocampus, becomes underactive. A lot of times, like I was talking about the young lady, their ability to retrieve and store memory becomes underactivated. But then we have the overactivation of that amygdala, and that's going to send us into that fight, flight, freeze response. All right, we're going to take a peek at this slide, but we are going to talk about the fight, flight, freeze, comply response later in this presentation. But I just want you to take a look at on the side here. When we are in our fight, flight response, the body reacts to stress, and the stress alerts the body to either get ready to fight, flight, freeze, or submit. The fight, flight response, it activates the sympathetic nervous system, and our pupils start to become dilated, our muscles will tighten, our airways become restricted, we start having rapid breathing. You know, that activates the hormones through the pituitary gland. We start producing lots of cortisol and adrenaline because we're getting ready to fight. That's our body's response of seeing a bear in the woods. What are we going to do? We need to be able to protect ourselves. So this is a protection response, and it's natural for our body. But when you have complex trauma or PTSD, people start to live in this every day, and it becomes a daily cycle. And over time, it starts to hurt our body because we never get to this bottom part here where our body is modulated and that we can engage in the social connections. Our body is essentially living in that fight, flight, or freeze response. All right. So some effects of trauma on the brain we've talked about is that our emotional processing centers, it's dysregulated, it's smaller, they're less effective. We're living in that stress response. So we have all that, those increased hormones going through our body. Our hormones are then becoming dysregulated. There's less white matter in the brain. So our executive functioning, we're not able to think rationally. We respond by fear and protection. All right. Again, the hippocampus, we're having difficulty with memory and storage retrieval. And here it comes, difficulties with sensory processing, with sensory discrimination, praxis, motor movements, and that essentially that sensory modulation. And then we tend to live in fear. And we respond to that fear by our flight, fright, and freeze and comply response. So just so we can get just a visual of this. This is actually, this picture, you'll see it a lot. It's a representation of a child on the left-hand side of the screen, a child that has normal, we'll call typical development. All right, you're gonna see lots of reds and yellows, and that's activation of the brain. All right, but then on the right-hand side, that is a child who may have grew up in, I think this suggests that the child grew up in a deprivation environment. They may have been institutionalized in an orphanage, I believe it says. And you're gonna see that there's very little response. There's very little red, very little yellow. It's mostly black and purples. So their brains are just not, the connections aren't there. It's not wiring. There's a lag. So essentially they start living into their, that fight, flight, and freeze response, the mode of protection. So let's just take a moment. I'm gonna look in the chat box here for a second and see if there's any questions that I can answer. All right.
Yep, so far I think we're good, Cicely.
All righty. We're gonna keep moving on. All right. So this is a big part, and even if you are, if there's a group of people here that work with adults, I've been working with children and families most of my career, and just in the past year and a half, I've taken a different position where I've started to work with a lot of adults in a community mobile health setting, and most of the adults I work with have grown up in a household that there's been trauma. Most of the adults that I work with are living in that flight, fright, freeze response. They are, you know, sometimes they'll be willing to talk about their traumas, and sometimes they still won't. A lot of their responses, a lot of the adults that I work with, unfortunately, engage in, I'll call it maladaptive coping techniques, to where, you know, they use substances. They don't have good relationships in the community. They're often re-victimized. I have a few clients who are working prostitutes. I have clients that new people move into their apartment complex, and it triggers a memory for them, and they go into, you know, a fight response where they start overreacting out in the hallway. So, you know, these children grow up into adults that have difficulty functioning in society. So let's take a peek. Just checking my time. All right. I'm probably going to do a little more talking in the initial first two slides, because this is infant, toddler, and school age. It has a really large effect on how complex trauma is going to affect these people later in their life. So we're going to take each slide, we're going to look at normal development, and then we're going to go back and we're going to look at how trauma impacted development at that time. I'll try to bring in a little bit of a story to each one. And if you have a question, like I said, they're moderated in the chat box, so go right ahead. So let's just talk quickly about infant and toddler normal development. You know, an infant, we know that they begin to build an attachment with their caregivers right from birth, all right, and within the family. At birth, the child relies on the caregiver to respond sensitively and discriminately to the infant's cues and needs. As they begin to develop a sense of self and awareness of body cues, they begin to learn interpersonal reactions. They begin to learn how to communicate and how to interact with others. And they begin to look and realize other people's expressions. Let's see, the child who receives consistent, sensitive care and responses from their caregivers, they begin to develop a basic sense of safety. They begin to develop an understanding and a responding, they become trustworthy of their caretakers. That early regulation, it happens in a sense of co-regulation. And that means that the infant depends on the caregiver to provide soothing, to provide comfort, stimulation, and over time they respond to consistent soothing. That the infant toddlers, they learn how to follow through with emotional states and development through those soothing techniques. When children feel, when they grow up and they're in a safe environment, they're going to start to explore their world through play. And then physical exploration, they're going to begin to develop their first senses of agency and their learning reactions. Agency is that they're learning how the environment reacts to, they can change the environment by their reactions. You know, and as they grow into preschoolers, they, you know, they do well with structured play, repetition, security. You know, they want their little lovey or their little animal when they go places. You know, my daughter, even my 4-year-old now, you know, we watch the same movie every single night. We want the same book every night, but that's providing her a sense of safety and security at that age. You know, we know they have little sense of time and space too. So through this infant and toddler, this is our normal development. We begin attachment with our caregivers. Our caregivers provide us with those soothing techniques. All right, we begin as a baby with looking at their faces, their expressions. We feel safe. But what's going to happen when we have an infant or a toddler that's trauma impacted? All right. So when the home is marked by chaos in which the child receives inadequate and unpredictable care, the child will begin to develop maladaptive and delayed skills in their development. The caregiver when they act with unpredictable responses, the child is unable to develop and interpret verbal and nonverbal communication. The children, they may adapt to communicating more strongly, or they begin to misinterpret cues and have difficulty with early relationships, especially with other peers and their teachers. When these children, when they're in the stressed environment, the soothing and regulation from their caregiver becomes inconsistent, or sometimes it's not provided at all. So they're not being able to learn these self-soothing techniques. All right. And then that creates an inability for them to regulate. You know, that they're learning that the emotions sometimes that they're frightening and that the arousal in their body is potential danger. Then the child may begin to disconnect or guard against physical experiences, or as the child goes through preschool, the self-soothing strategies may continue to be primitive. They may still want a binky or blanket, or they may react in fear, and sometimes they might be labeled as bossy or controlling. You know, so in the absence of a safe system, the exploration of the external world would be impacted. So they're not, when exploration is impacted, so is that agency. So they're not learning. That's part of critical thinking. You know, the child in the stressed environment, they have less control, less impact, and less predictability in their world. And then they may internalize helplessness at that point. You know, the loss of structure and safety at this age can lead the child to develop rigid control strategies They start to have anxiety, and then they use those rigid control strategies to manage their anxiety. And then again, they might be labeled as a child who's bossy, or they might be a child that might be labeled as, they're manipulating. But that's what they've learned to gain control in their life. All right. We're talking about little kids here, preschoolers, So this affects the child at this very early age. I'll even talk about every time I think about this infant. I had when I was in inpatient psych, I had this little boy. He came in, he was 5 years old, and he essentially looked like he was always hyperactive. He was always running around, always risk taking. He definitely showed some sensory seeking ways. He would lick the walls. He would chew on things. He would he'd just be bouncing off the walls. So one day I don't know what upset him. And at that time I had my first daughter, and this child started crying uncontrollably. And it was like having an infant, just the wand that could not self-soothe. And a few times I watched his reactions to this stress. And one time he was in my room and I said, okay, that's it. I had everyone leave. I kept this little boy with me, and I did what I would do with my infant daughter. I wrapped him up in a blanket, I snuggled him up as tight as I could get him. I gave him a piece of gum to chew on, and I took him and I put him in my lap, and we sat in the rocking chair, and I cuddled him as best I could until he soothed. And after that, he would start coming to the room, and we would do more sensory integrative approach techniques, because he could not learn how to self-soothe. He needed that co-regulation, and it was very infantile the way he reacted to stress. So be aware of that. And then just so you know this child's history, he and his sister, well, actually, the sister wasn't going to school. So eventually, when the CPS came to the house, these children, they were locked in a bedroom. They were locked in a bedroom with literally a pot to pee and go to the bathroom in, with no food, no neglect. Apparently, the room that they were in was full of feces and urine and old food, and they were essentially locked in this bedroom. And after that, they were removed from the home. So this child probably suffered extreme neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect. Who knows if he had ever been to a doctor? I don't know what they were eating. So this child had probably had that since infancy. All right, we're going to move to school age. So school age, you're going to start seeing a lot of behaviors, okay? So school age normal development, the children start to begin to go to a world outside of their family. They're going to start having peers, teachers, sense of community, all right? They're going to start to discover that they can produce and create and accomplish their own internal assets and begin to develop pride when they go to school. It's part of their identity development. They're starting to move from that concrete preschool thinking of, I'm a girl and I'm smart or whatever, to I'm pretty good at math, but I have a hard time reading. So they're starting to be more absolute with their thinking. Children who have positive experiences at school, they start to improve their self-esteem, and they start to build relationships with people outside of their family. So what you might see for children school age that could have trauma impacted development. This is where you're going to see a lot of children acting out in school. They're using oftentimes self-protective behaviors. But a lot of times at this age, you're going to see impairments with peers and school functioning. That's when our parents are going to start getting a lot of phone calls from school. Children that haven't learned to be successful that with their earliest caregivers, they're going to have difficulties with developing competent relationships with their peers and other adults. You know, also those kids that lost the ability for early exploration, had failure, that's going to affect their school performance. It's going to affect their cognitive development. You know, we talked about the hippocampus earlier and the ability for executive functioning. So they're gonna have difficulties with concentration, ability to modulate their arousal levels, ability for behavior and impulse control. They're gonna have a lot of decreased frustration tolerance, and they may have difficulties with positive peer relationships. And, you know, that's when these kids start becoming, you know, a lot of that failure takes a toll on them, and they start to put that in their sense of self, that you know, they develop that negative concept of them. Nobody likes me. You know, I really hate when I hear little kids say, you know, I would go to school, but nobody there likes me. My teachers hate me. I can't go to so-and-so anymore, like a park or a place that they used to like, because I'm a bad boy. You know, these children are starting to have to build a negative self-concept. You know, I'll use a little story about my little friend Douglas. In school, he would always be sent to the occupational therapy room. But Douglas, you know, he had a difficult time. He was very impulsive. Oftentimes he'd be like silly, very, very silly in the classroom, or he'd be frustrated and he'd throw his papers on the floor, or he'd rip them up, he'd throw his pencils away. Or if I seen him in physical education class, you know, he'd become dysregulated, and the kids would be running around the gym, and he'd be in the middle of the gym giggling and laughing in the middle of the floor, because he wasn't able to regulate himself. And I remember one time he came into the OT room crying his eyes out because his teacher at that time gave him a frowny face. He had to get, what, 5 happy faces by the end of the day, or he'd get a frowny face. So he came in, he was very distraught over this frowny face that he got from his teacher. And we talked about it, and I said, well, you know, he goes, well, I can't go home now. You have to take me home. I said, what's going on, Douglas? He goes, well, when I get a frowny face, my father hits me with the belt. And I'm not saying that his father abused this child, but, you know, that's probably how the father was raised too. And father was doing what he knew is punishment. But, you know, as I got to know this child, what happened when he was an infant, his mother was a substance abuse user. The father ended up getting custody. The father was actually, he was a nice man, but he had difficulty raising Douglas on his own because the father worked full-time, more than full-time, 60 hours a week. And he was always trying to get Douglas to a babysitter. And then the mother would say that she was going to come pick him up and didn't. So this kid, you know, I could hear the teachers and everybody in school saying how, you know, this kid was aggressive, he was frustrated, what a behavior problem he was. But when they looked at the history, this child had complex trauma and it wasn't being addressed. And we saw his needs being acted out through his behavior. So you're going to see a lot of these guys in school. Teenagers, oh boy. All right, so adolescence, normal development, again, they go through a lot of rapid changes in a few years, but their cognitive skills begin to develop, and so do the social development. They begin, you know, their self-identity, and they're going through a lot of, you know, physiological changes. All right, but the other thing is that they're becoming aware of how the outside world views them, so their perspective is changing. You know, they might seem self-absorbed, but it's really just a lack of their being more aware of how the outside world is viewing them. You know, and in our adolescence, there is a healthy separation from early caregivers, and they're going to look for their peers as a source of references. You know, and then the future is becoming more real and meaningful for them. So adolescence trauma impacted. This is a really high risk time for children who had complex trauma in their lives. It's a high risk time because of all the rapid changes, and they don't have the developed skills to help regulate their own experiences and interactions. All right, they might already feel different, and now that they're realizing that they really are different. But traumatized teens continue to rely on their more primitive coping skills too, because they haven't had that development. They may rely on an over control or perfectionism. They may become more isolated. You'll see some teenagers, they're going to stop going to school. They're going to hide in their rooms. A lot of times these are the kids that might be just playing video games all day, locking themselves up away from others. Or you're going to see maybe the opposite. You're going to see teenagers relying on external means of modulation. And this could be really starting to experience with substance use, cutting, sensation seeking behaviors, fast cars, fast life there. And these are the kids that may experience more with sexual interactions, and they may eventually become re-victimized through that. But what do we also, another thing that I start to see, with teenagers is a lot of the labeling is that, we might have a teenage girl that comes in and we notice that she's cutting. So what are we saying? Oh, she's a budding borderline. She has these behavior traits. Well, let's stop the labeling and let's look at why she's cutting. What happened in her life? What is missing, and what did they need now? Why is this teenager locked in a room playing video games? What kind of self-concept do they have now that they fear being out there and, being social? So teenagers have a lot of difficulty at that time. And then lastly, just quickly, young adulthood. We're going to talk about this because, like I said, kids grow up, children turn into adults. When we turn into adults, we're finally gaining that self-identity. We're starting to engage in meaningful occupations, whether it be school, working, leisure activities. We're able to reevaluate our lives and look at the choices that we made. Normal young adults can function fairly independently. They start to go off and live on their own, and they have healthier attachments. But the young adults, even into adulthood, that have experienced trauma, they may have those impact that functioning across all the domains in their life. They may have a poor self-identity. They may go into those depressive states, or they may have self-blame, guilt. They may feel powerless. They may end up in abusive relationships. Sometimes the cycle of trauma starts all over for them. They have their own children. They may have domestic violence in their house. They may have unstable moods. They may look for food. They may look for substance use. They may look for, I got a young lady, when I could tell when she's not feeling well because she wants money to go shopping. So what happens is, because they were not able to self-soothe as a child, they weren't safe, that caregiver was not able to provide that co-regulation, they did not learn the skills. So what happens is they when they get to be adults, they look for those numbing types of things, possibly through substances. They look at, I feel really good when I could go out shopping and get something. But what's missing is that they don't have the ability to make relationships. And that is really impacted because they're not able to have relationships in the community, at work, at school, things that maybe a functional young adult is seeking.
Cicily, this is Kathleen. There is a question.
Okay.
It says, so let's see, I have a question. If one or two parents had a traumatic childhood, would they be creating that same trauma for their own children without identifying it or being aware?
I'm going to say, because I don't know them, I don't want to give an exact answer, but we, through our experiences, often, not all the time, but often, it continues as a cycle. A lot of times, the adults, we just talked about, because of the trauma that happened as a child, they don't have the skills as an adult, whether it be cognitively to problem solve. Is it possible that they can be, using substances? Could they be in poverty? They may not have the frustration tolerance, and it could lead to, some type of abuse. They may not be emotionally well themselves, so they may not be able to provide that emotional support to a child. So oftentimes you'll see that, you ever hear this saying, you plant corn, you get corn? Sometimes most of the adults and children that I work with have, I'm not saying all of them because it's not true for everybody, but many of them have a parent who is a parent or two parents that have gone through the same types of trauma. So it is possible. I hope that answered your question, Tiffany. So that's where, and you all work with children and families. So sometimes, when you work with children, you guys know this, that you're really going to start working with the parents or the family too. So.
Cicely,
Yes.
in her question though, it's, and I was just wondering, because you're saying that, she was
sorry.
saying that she was not aware. Could they be not aware of what they're doing? So if they haven't done the work themselves, they may very well be unaware that they're planting these seeds.
Oh,
for
yes, because that's normal for them. Yes, Sue, thank you for saying that, because what they grew up as, that was normal for them. I work with a lot of young people right now. I have this young man, he has some skills, but I can't get him to get motivated to do, to get a little part-time job or to even volunteer. But, I have to sit back and I have to look at his family. Well, his family, most of them are all on disability. Nobody really works. I'm not saying that that's a terrible thing, but what I'm saying is that that's what he knows. He knows that I have a mental illness, I get Social Security, disability, and that's all I have to do. And, we're trying to educate him as, you have the skills, my friend, you can do this. So I think that, yes, I think that they may not recognize it because they don't know any better, because they've been through that themselves, and that's their normal. So we're going to talk about ACE study quickly, because there's all trauma informed presentations will always probably say something about this study. All right. I won't spend a lot of time because I'm sure that everybody here has heard of it before. But the ACE study, it's the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and Kaiser Permanente, they hosted this study from 1995 to 1997, and they wanted to look at, did you have a stressful or traumatic childhood? And as an adult, do you have these physical symptoms, or, how did you turn out as an adult? So they actually were very surprised to find out that 63% of the people that were in this study, there's 17,000 participants. This is a large study. That 63% of the people had at least one adverse childhood experience. And we're going to look at those on the next slide. All right. And 20% of the people in the study, 20% had 3 or more categories of trauma. And they're called ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience. So essentially, they found out through this study is that the more ACEs somebody had, the more somebody answered yes to, these are the 10 ACEs that were asked. The more someone answered yes to these questions, the more that they had adverse experiences later in life also. So, they found out through that study that 28% of the people experience some type of physical abuse, and that they may have grown up in a household with somebody using alcohol or drugs. A quarter of the participants had a parent gone due to separation or divorce. And that's a huge number. 21% experienced sexual abuse. Grew up with someone that was mentally ill in their household. Experienced emotional neglect, domestic violence, emotional abuse, physical neglect, or grew up with a parent or family member in jail or prison. So these are the 10 ACEs here. And the more ACEs you have, what the study found out is the more likely as an adult you may have some of these factors happen in your life. You are more likely to have chronic obstruction pulmonary disease, probably partially due because we may pick up some bad habits such as smoking. They're 7 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 7 times more likely to become a smoker, 10 times more likely to use substance or illicit drugs, 12 times more likely to have a suicide attempt. They may engage in risky sexual behaviors. Sometimes they look at food. We may become obese, or the opposite. We may have could have some type of eating disorder. And they also are at chronic risk or at risk for chronic illnesses, such as heart disease, lung disease, autoimmune deficiencies. There's research out there saying that fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome often are related to someone that has had PTSD or complex trauma in their lives. So that's a big study. And the more ACEs that you have, the more likely you are to have these in your life as an adult. Any more questions in the chat box?
Nothing new has come in. We do have a comment that sometimes they may become a product of their environment, whether that's knowingly or maybe unknowingly. So that was a good comment. I wanted to share that. But.
Yes, and that's true. And and what's hard is working with children is that they're not able to just get up and leave. They're not able to just say, this isn't working for me anymore, I'm out of here. They're victims, they're trapped into this. And oftentimes the parent, like I said, they may or may not knowingly put that neglect on that child. So let's do something for a minute. Let's take a 5-minute breather. It is 11:03. And let's come back at 11:07, and then we'll target the last half of this presentation. So just a quick get up and stretch break and be right back. I'm surprised she hasn't yet, so we're doing pretty good. All right. So we're going to get to the second portion of this topic today, and that is why we're here. So let's learn about some trauma-informed care practices, and let's change our perspective. By doing so, sorry, I'm going to start blaming the cat because that's better than blaming the operator.
Well, one of the things you didn't say, Cicely, is that as many times as you have spoken and done presentations, they've always been in person and interactive and wonderful. And this is your first time presenting on Zoom. So just to let everybody know.
Yeah, it is what it is in the moment, but I'm ready to be back in person. When you're in person, it's we can have so many much more interaction. When you're doing a Zoom, it's great, but it's difficult because you can't see the crowd. You can't have that same type of interaction. So hopefully next time we can all get together. All right, so what we're going to try, what we want to do today is start using a trauma-informed lens. All right, we want to start to be able to look at the person. You know, what is their behavior right now? What's the body language and what's the environment? Can we stop saying, oh, they're being defiant, they're aggressive, they're being manipulative, they're controlling. And can we start looking at what's going on in the environment right now? Is it loud? Is it chaotic? You know, look at this child. Are they with a clenched fist? Are their bodies tight? And start looking at their behavior and noticing maybe their behavior is just a maladaptive skill in the moment that they're using to protect themselves. We want to explore. We want to definitely know what has happened to that person. We don't necessarily always want to say, hey, what happened to you or what's going on, but knowing maybe some background might help you make an informed decision of their behavior and why that they might be acting that way, you know, and asking, are you okay? How can I help you today? And providing that safe environment. You know, are their basic needs met? You know, I worked with kids for a long time. They're hungry. They're hungry. And let's see. So a child that has been abused or neglected or doesn't have food in the home, they can get hangry. And we've made lots of hangry emojis and faces, and we put hangry right up when we're learning about feelings. You know, and that's a basic need. Are their basic needs met? Do they need to use the bathroom? You know, kids that come out of poverty, how many kids have I had that just don't have clean clothes, that don't have clothes that are dirty or holes in them? I had a young man and he got a new pair of shoes and you thought what he had. And then come to find out he hadn't had a new pair of shoes in years. You know, so we take for granted what we have, and sometimes we don't realize that that's, you know, that these people in general, that their basic needs aren't being met. I work with adults that get $200 a month in SNAP benefits. Well, how, you know, and I always say that you can't go, I can spend that in one shopping trip if I'm buying, you know, good, nutritious food. You know, the basic needs sometimes just aren't being met, you know, and looking at how we can support and how we can provide safe environments. Oops, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go all the way through, aren't I? Okay, hopefully we're gonna start here, or may go from. Okay. See, we had to talk about first timers. I apologize. I'm sure that there's a much easier way to do this besides hitting this button, but that's what I know in the moment. All right, so let's get back to, you know, recognizing when a trigger, okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, and looking at the environment, looking at the behavior. We know that our body's alarm system is going off, and what can make that alarm system go off? You know, for children and adults, for anyone that has suffered trauma in their lives, but, you know, an unpredictable or sudden change. I work with an adult that anytime that there's a new person that moves into her apartment complex, for a month, we have to go through symptoms of PTSD because she's afraid of them, because she doesn't know them. And she has a long history of abuse. You know, and even children, sudden changes in their environment. Even just going from one classroom to another sometimes, or having an unpredictable environment. Children thrive in predictable environments. transitioning from one activity to another or one setting to another. You know, it could activate our body's alarm system, loss of control. People that have a lot of trauma, not always, but often try to control their environments because it's self-protection. All right. Child could be feeling vulnerable or feeling rejected. It used to really bother me when a teacher would kick a kid out of the classroom. That just would, I mean, sometimes I can understand that, you know, it was difficult to have something going on with all the kids, but that just, the child just would, the relationship would be changed. They'd say, they don't like me anymore. I can't do anything right. Body's alarm system, confrontation, authority, or limit setting. How do some of our kids react when we say no? The body alarm system goes off. I've had adults, a man I was talking to the other day, we were having a great conversation and a police officer drove by and his whole presentation changed. You know, that authority triggered something of past experience in him. Knowing the environment, sensory overload. Is there chaos in the environment? Are there people yelling? Are they even, you know, Chuck E. Cheese? You know, the environment is too much. They don't have that regulation yet. And it just, the body's alarm system kicks in. Or oftentimes you'll see that situations perceived as unfair or unjust. So essentially, what is a trigger? You know, really a trigger is it's unhealed trauma. And it triggers could be anything. It could be a sight, it could be a sound, smell, touch, something that reminds them of that trauma. And here's the other thing too, the younger, remember we talked about in that infant toddler stage that, you know, they're learning through nonverbal ways, is that those children that were abused at a very, very young age, that just a smell or a touch, something that is nonverbal can trigger a person, can trigger some kind of memory. You know, they might have a flashback, which is an occurring memory or feeling or thoughts, and that sometimes that stress brings the past into the present. Another part about using our lens is we want to start to learn what are the warning signs. We really got to sit back and observe over time. You know, is the person pacing? Do they have clenched fists? You know, what is starting to learn the warning signs, because that's the precursor to the crisis. We all know once we're in a crisis, we got to ride the wave of the crisis. But how do we stop it before it happens if possible? And that's knowing the warning signs, knowing the people that you work with, knowing their facial expressions. I have a lady I look at, I just can tell in her eyes that day that something has happened. You know, even working with younger children, you can see, are they starting to get really silly? You know, are they starting to clown around per se in front of the other kids? That can actually be a warning sign or a precursor, you know. So we have to be a good observer. But sometimes, you know, sometimes signals aren't observable. But the child may say, "Oh, I have a bellyache today." You know, some of those somatic symptoms get such you know, you hear people shrug them off. Oh, that's just another headache. It's just another bellyache. But those can also be a warning sign that they have some distress, because we know the gut and the brain are connected. And oftentimes that, you know, we have some stomach distress or our head hurts. And, you know, sometimes the kids, they aren't able to talk about it. So they might say it's a physical symptom. So some, you know, trauma that you might want to just take a peek at are some of the trauma related symptoms or behaviors we might see. We might see disassociation, and that's because that's how that person was able to, that's their coping skill. That's that maladaptive coping skill that they learned as a child, was to shut down, to shut it off. You know, they could say they have a flashback. That hypervigilance, you know, look for that, you know, the alertness. Are their eyes getting wide? Are they clenching their fists? Are they looking around the room? Do they almost look like they're in fear or freeze? You know, are they anxious? You know what another sign is too? I'm not saying it's always a sign of trauma, but it's a sign of possible being anxious is when a little kid, all of a sudden they start going on their tippy toes and start walking around. That is often a sign of the child is anxious. You know, they could, they could have hallucinations. It's possible. Difficulty with problem solving. When you're in a fight or flight response, you're not trying to solve the problem through critical thinking. You're thinking, am I either going to fight this bear or am I going to run away from it? So there's not a lot of executive functioning happening in that moment. We may go to numbness, depression, possible substance use, again, self-injury, eating problems. They may become again, continue the cycle of victimization, or they may become aggressive because they're going into that fight flight. So let's talk about it for a minute, that stress response, okay? We're going to have that fight, flight, freeze, or comply. And some of the things that we might see, all right, when we're into that fight response, remember, that's when we're physically becoming aroused. There may be aggression, there may be irritability or anger, there's trouble concentrating, and that's because we're not using this part of our brain. We're using our limbic system. That amygdala has activated the rest of the body to be able to fight off whatever we're fearing at the moment. But sometimes in children, you might see that they become hyperactive or silly, and that could actually be part of the hyperarousal in that response. Flight, that's often the child that will try to withdraw or escape from the situation. We always say, oh, that child they eloped from the classroom. Well, what are they eloping from? It may not, we see that behavior, but a lot of times the kids that elope often have sensory processing problems. So the classroom may be too loud or chaotic. The home may be too loud or chaotic. So they're running away from it. All right. Sometimes they have a lot of avoidance of other people. They can sit alone, or even at recess, they just go do their own thing. Sometimes that could not be a bad thing because they need to step away from the environment that they're trying to get away from. But just knowing that, being more aware of that could be a flight response. Freezing, becoming hypervigilant. We may, we may have a constricted emotional expression where all of a sudden fear has come over us. It's a stilling behavior. And that's when the parasympathetic goes into a different response and we begin to shut down. All right. But something that we also got to remember too is, that submitting or to comply. And that could be the child that's appeasing or accommodating to others. They may be over compliance, or they may say, no, I'm fine. They deny their needs. They have pleasing behaviors, or they deny or affect their reaction. I just, little example of this is I had a young man, he was in the children's psychiatric center that I worked in, and some of the teenage girls, something happened. There was a fight in the room, and somehow this little guy got punched in the face. And the nurse came and she goes, oh, he took it so well. He just sat there and didn't do anything and then told the girls that everything was okay and he didn't mind. And she goes, he responded so well to it. And I thought, no, that is not a normal response. That is a complacency response. What has happened in that kid's life that he thinks it's okay that somebody could beat him up? Why does that child think it's okay that, he just has to say, oh, no problem. You can beat me up anytime you want. That is also a way that we respond. But it's not a normal response. It's a maladaptive response. All right. So again, changing our lens, because sometimes we perceive those behaviors as that kid's aggressive. You know, especially in new situations. That kid, we're always having a power struggle because they're controlling. Well, they are controlling because they are trying to control their environment because of whatever stressors are going on. That's the way that they're responding. You know, they might interpret that these rules or that authority is predatory. And that's where the kids, you know, they might have their meltdowns, that a minor event such as changing an activity or changing a classroom, they're going to have a catastrophic reaction. So that's the kids that have these easily melt down. All right. But what might be actually happening, is that, you know, is it possible that they have experienced some abuse or neglect in their lives? Is it possible that the behaviors that we're witnessing have a deeper connection to what happened and how that that's how they can have some self-control? All right, they're reacting in a self-protective way, and that might come through those behaviors of fight, flight, freeze, or comply. Let's see, you know, that these behaviors are, I like that, you know, they're seen as an attempt to master like some extremely difficult environments, and they didn't learn how to express their feelings yet. These are kids that need to learn. They've learned how to express their feelings through these maladaptive types of behaviors. And just remembering that, you know, these people, they're doing the best they can with what they know. I actually was introduced to this quote not too long ago, and I thought, oh, that will go well in this section. But, you know, behavior that started off as adaptive to the environment, what we learned through the earlier portion of this presentation through that neurodevelopment, but now as a teenager, as an adult, even a school student, as a young adult, as an older adult, I have a lady who's 65 years old, and we are still dealing with a lot of these maladaptive techniques that she's learned because she had to self-protect. But then they become problematic in other environments or as people grow older. All right, let's check up in the chat box real quick. I haven't looked, so all righty.
Doesn't seem to be anything in there right now. So I think you're
all right.
good.
Oh, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you having said, oh, that lady doesn't know what she's doing. But like I said, I am used to presenting in person, and I can't wait. But you know what? At least right now, through all of this, we had Zoom. Could you imagine going through I'm going to get off topic now, but going through the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 when we didn't have Zoom or anything to stay socially connected? So it had to be a much different time then. Okay, any questions right now, or we'll move into the last section? All right, we're going to move on here. All right, so let's talk about all right, so now we have a basic background of, let's look at the behavior. What could have happened to this person? Knowing why they may act this way in different parts because of where we had trauma in different parts of their development. So what can we do about it? All right. First thing first that we have to do, especially if we know that we need to be how about this? We need to be trauma informed with every person we come in contact with, because we don't know what other people have been through, period. I mean, yes, a lot of us are parents. A lot of us work with children and families that have had trauma as part of their history. But even our coworkers, you know, they may have gone through things that we don't know about. So just always being trauma informed with everybody that we share an environment with. But the first thing we have to do is create a safe environment. We have to begin by building that safe and trusting relationships. because as we learned that, you know, because we're talking about children today and complex trauma, is that the trauma was early life onset, when we as people should be providing, you know, co-regulation, helping our children self-soothe, providing them safe environments. It didn't, for whatever reasons, it didn't happen. So that's our first step, is trying to build a trusting relationship and a safe environment for the people we work with, and especially for any foster parents out there. You know, I'm sure that it has to be difficult having a child come in the home, especially initially, because, you know, it's different, things are changing, but just providing that safe environment, you know, and we don't know everybody's triggers. You know, this is, sometimes we have, unfortunately, we may not know those things until it happens, but just being aware of it and being a good observer. Okay, so again, I'm an occupational therapist. I'm not a physician, so I'm not going to really talk today about any type of medication, because that's not my lane. All right, but my lane is to educate people, parents, and children about different types of activities and strategies that they can use to help heal trauma. And we're going to talk about body therapies, because as we talked about today, our bodies and our brains have been changed because of the trauma in our lives. And that embeds in our brains and our organs and our muscles and everything we do. There is a lot of evidence out there for trauma-informed yoga. And trauma-informed yoga, the trauma-informed part of it is really like, and you know, when you go to a yoga class, you follow the instructor. But when you do trauma-informed yoga, it's a little bit different, because it's inviting the person to come in. We always say, only do what your body wants you to, what you're comfortable with. We actually use like little a green and red circle on the floor. Green circle says it's okay if you touch me, and you just and then you could do the red one, and it's okay, please don't touch me. So it's just being letting the person have control. But the other thing is massage therapy and therapeutic touch, because our bodies hold the trauma essentially in our muscles. That massage therapy is going to help to soothe the body, because a lot of people are living in that fight flight stage. They're hyper, or have some hypervigilancy. They are afraid of touch, and touch can be very powerful. It can be very powerful soothing somebody, or it could even be a trigger. But finding someone that can provide therapeutic touch to a person. And if you are going to touch a person, say a child that you don't know well, always start with maybe by touching someone's hand, because that way they can touch you back, not necessarily touching someone from behind or on the shoulder, because that could be a triggering response. Cranial sacral therapy. Well, anyone that lives in Utica anyway, but my friend Carol works over at Mohawk Valley Health Systems, and she's and Judy Rosinski also over in New York Mills. They have a lot of training in cranial sacral therapy, and it helps the body to release some of the energies. The body, oh, you know what? Now I'm getting a little off track, but I don't, if anyone gets the Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Von der Kolk, this is a great book. It's a little thick, but it's okay. I actually, once I picked it up, I ended up reading the whole book in a couple of days, because it just sucked me in. But it really talks about how the body is holding all these emotions inside. And that's what the cranial sacral therapy will help do. It helps release some of the emotions and release patterns, because sometimes we might be in a holding pattern to where, you know, because I'm always in that fight, flight, or freeze. I got my shoulders up and I'm always ready to fight, and I'm in my holding pattern. And through the therapeutic massage and through the cranial sacral, they'll work on breaking up those patterns of holding. And pattern movement and exercise, that's because of what has happened to the brain. The brain is not rhythmic anymore. So going through pattern movement or exercise, karate types of activities, yoga, even brain gym, if anyone still talks about that anymore, that will help the brain become more in sync. Play therapy, I put on here, but I'm thinking more natural play therapy, letting the kids get out and explore a safe environment, because it's possible that they could have been in an environment they were not able to explore, you know, going to the park, and a lot of sensory-based motor play. You know, but there are two things that I didn't put up here, and I probably should have. But mindfulness activities, learning, we talked earlier about that interoception, that ability to feel, you know, to be able to feel your heartbeat, to be able to feel when your belly's full, to be able to feel that you need to use the toilet. Being more mindful and becoming in tune with your body is going to help with that interoception. You know, when you're doing mindfulness, they tell you to listen. Can you hear your heartbeat? Listen to your body. What is your body telling you? Because when we're in that fight, flight, freeze, that part shut down. It's dysregulated. And another plug is for neurofeedback. I had a little experience with it quite a long time ago, but essentially they hook you up to a computer system, and you have to use your brain to change the waves in your brain, and it'll help produce calming and focusing. I know that there's people from all around the state, but I saw something in the newspaper. There's some people in Chittenango that are doing that now too. Let's see. I lost my stuff here, but that's okay. So we're going to talk about, you know, more clinic-based types of therapies. Now, this isn't something that I do a lot of. I am not a social worker or a psychologist. I'm an occupational therapist, so a lot of my experience is in the body therapies. I can talk about them a lot more, but these are just a few of a lot of therapies that can be used for trauma disorder. But cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's, you know, talking about it, becoming, using that fear, talking about the fear, and can it hurt you now, bringing, you know, some of the past to the future, and how do we cognitively deal with that. Play therapy, we have a great play therapist in our area, and she'll, especially for the children, they can role play through, and that might actually also get a lot of history, because a lot of the times the children will play through what they've seen or know. So it's a great time to observe and take notes about what you may have to think of. Also, like role playing or even a drama club, Dr. Vanderklok talks a lot about that. Is, you know, in his book, he talks about he went to there was a group of women that had domestic violence and other traumas in their lives, and everybody in the group had, you know, kind of like the frozen faces. There wasn't a whole lot of expression, and he was amazed that through role playing, through drama, through music, through expressive arts, maybe I can put it that way, that people can learn more about emotions and let those emotions come out, have more expressions in your face and body. And let's see, this ARC, the attachment, regulation, and competency, it's a model, and it works with the entire family. It works at how do we begin to build attachments, again, through people in the family. It helps on working with the children to be able to regulate, and you know, how do they become competent? So it's a whole model. You have to really be able to work with a provider that can work with you over time. And then another one is this integrative treatment of complex trauma. I'm not that familiar with it. I haven't had anyone go through that program, but it's they do a lot of exposure therapies to trauma and then working through it. But they're, you know, depending on the therapist, either the social worker or psychologist that you work with, that is going to depend on what their background is. You know, but hold on 1 second, I apologize. Okay.
Was that the
Some
cat?
things that no, it was a spam call on the home phone and I couldn't concentrate.
Our life on Zoom. Okay.
Yeah, the cat will come out by the end, I'm sure here. You know, so just some strategies and adaptations, just as a parent or a teacher or anybody that works with children or even adults. Like I said, I have more adults that I've been working with lately, older adults, young adults and older adults. And I use this with them too, praise, reinforcement, and problem solving. You know, they've built that a lot of the people that have gone through trauma have built a negative self-image. And, you know, we need to build awareness of their successes, you know, and when we talk about, you know, we got to shift the focus from that bad behavior to the positive behavior. Stop using the focus of, oh my God, I can't believe you ripped up that paper and threw it on the floor. You're, you know, you're being so defiant. Shift that to where we have to start saying, oh, thank you for trying your best on your math homework today, Jimmy. Let me finish helping you with it. Or, you know, or you're pretty good at math. Can we do this together? So shifting from putting focus on whatever the bad behavior is to the positive behavior. And you've probably heard of that PBIS, the positive behavior and supports intervention techniques. That you see a lot of that in schools now. So we start looking at what are the positive things, you know, and we have to label the behaviors. You know, I'm proud of you that you did such a good job. You were listening when I asked you to clean up. So how do we start to label the behaviors so they can learn what is the positive behavior? This is what we want to see. You make mommy happy when you clean up after yourself, or I'm so happy that you ate all your dinner tonight, or look at you, you were able to sit at the table for 10 minutes to finish your homework. That's wonderful. Or, you know, so starting to be able to label what the expectations are for the child or even the adult, you know, and giving them the ability to problem solve, because we all know that, you know, when we have complex trauma or trauma, that portion of our brain is underactive, and we have to build their awareness of them being able to make choices and to start being able to think critically. All right, so, you know, given the kids their toolbox, there's lots of activities where you can make a toolbox per se, and what are we going to put in it? You know, letting the kids start to learn what helps them, having them starting to say, this helps me do what, you know, have some natural modulation activities such as the playground, or sitting down and reading. That can also be helpful. You know, bringing in the sensory strategies such as hugs, but again, knowing what their trauma history is, if that's okay. Using the weighted blankets. Some people like the scented lotions, sound, therapeutic touch, different textures of food. Other activities too, especially for children, but really again for adults or anybody that's had some type of trauma, is letting them have that comfort zone, letting them create a space that is for them, where they can go and they can have whatever preferred activity that they like, whether it's a book or drawing or coloring. Or my daughter, even sometimes she likes to go in in their little tent and just play with the flashlight. But having that safe space that is theirs, maybe something that they can have in their toolbox. and this is a big portion too, especially working with children, is the social emotional regulation, being able to express their feelings and learn their feelings. I had a little boy, and every time, at least I thought, okay, that he was either frustrated or angry or mad or whatever, he would just kick. I had bruised shins for, oh geez, at least 2 weeks. This little boy, that's all he did, kick, 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 kick. And we really, the kids love working with the emojis. I think that they can just relate to them. Um, and just for 2 weeks working with him about, this is how I feel when I get angry. This is how I feel when I get mad. Well, I went down to the unit and all of a sudden he comes out and he starts kicking me and he goes, I'm angry. And I said, yes, you're angry. And I, I kind of almost laughed at myself, but he was finally able to put some type of expression to how he felt in the moment, because he was just labeled as a little, kicker. That's all. He was just a little aggressive kid. He wanted to kick, but he finally expressed that whatever was happening in that moment, he was angry. But it takes time. It takes time for these guys to learn. So being able to express their feelings, um, practicing kindness. A lot of people that grew up in complex trauma, they haven't had nice, kind people around. But also for them to practice kindness, for them to learn those skills. What is it to be a good friend? What is it to hold the door open for somebody else? So then hopefully that makes them have that internal sense of feeling better about, their self-concept. Finding purpose. A lot of the children and even the adults I work with, they don't have a lot of, I'll say, occupations. They don't have a lot of leisure interests. They don't have a lot of friendships. They don't sometimes always work or go to school, or, what are their purposes? Look at their strengths. What are they good at? Um, you know, Sometimes using positive affirmations, practicing gratitude, encouraging self-love, encouraging that they need to love themselves, and they need to find people that are going to love them, and starting to practice self-reflection. You'd be surprised that, at first it's very difficult for, you want them to, how did you feel during that? Or what could have gone better? Or, how would you like to change? At first, the kids have a difficult time with answering that, but the more you practice that, you would be surprised that they really are in tune with themselves. But they don't always have the ability to express it, especially positively.
Cicely, this is Kathleen.
Yeah.
There is a question in the chat box in reference to the toolbox that you spoke of, and what can we put in the adolescence toolbox?
Good question. Okay, depending on who the adolescent, what if they're, I would have somebody, it depends if they're developmentally delayed, I guess, or not. But I found that DBT skills have been very helpful for a lot of adolescents. Deep breathing techniques. DBT talks about using your wise mind, which is a combination of your emotional mind and your rational mind. And they talk about using a technique called STOP, to where you have to stop, feel the emotion, all right, and then make a choice. So sometimes you may, in an adolescent's toolbox, you may start using more of those cognitive type of approaches. But I've also had a lot of adolescents that like fidgets. Sometimes they do want like a squeezy type of thing that they can just use, like a stress ball type of thing. Sometimes they look at, but the adolescents, they start really doing a lot more with some type of cognitive based techniques. Sometimes the girls, will wear rubber bands around their wrists, especially if they're someone that might be cutting, because that gives them this, at least a sensation to feel something, and then be able to think about, before I cut, let me think rationally about the emotion that I'm having right now. So I don't know if that, those type of quick techniques for, I wouldn't say quick techniques. I would say quiet techniques, because deep breathing, these are things that an adolescent can do like by themselves or walk away. It's not so, because the adolescents, they don't want people watching them or looking different. So some of those techniques can be used with the adolescents. But there are adolescents out there that they need to be into sports. They need that heavy activity. There's adolescents out there that do enjoy those weighted blankets at home, that they enjoy the space. A lot of adolescents, sometimes they like books. They might be walking around with a book, because that's how they're going to self-regulate, is to sit and calm and escape for a little while in a book.
Cicely, I did want to let you know that we are at about a 10-minute warning for our
Yep.
presentation today.
Yep, this is my last slide for the presentation, so we can take any more questions. But, really, okay, Dr. Bruce Perry, if you haven't heard about him, you're going to start hearing about him more, even though he's been around for a while. This is one of his books, Born for Love, but he's got a few other ones. You're going to start hearing about him because him and Oprah Winfrey, why I'm having a little brain lapse now, the name of their book. Someone can put it up in the chat, but she talks about her complex trauma as a child, because Dr. Bruce Perry, he is out of Houston, Texas, and him and Oprah Winfrey the book just came out maybe 2 weeks ago, and she's going to, I've been waiting for it because it was like $65. I don't have that kind of money, but it's probably better now. But she's going to talk about her trauma as a child, and he's talking about, he's the medical doctor, so he's going to talk about how trauma affects people. So, but if you can Google Dr. Perry, he's got a lot on the internet. I really enjoy listening to him, because he says the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely they're going to be able to recover from trauma, and that it's the relationships that they make which are the powerful change agents. And he talks about just human love, and people need to care. People want to be cared about, and they didn't get that as a child. So we need to be respectful of that, working with children and adults, and always use a trauma-informed care approach with them. Let's see what's up here in this little chat box here.
Looks like the title of the book is What Happened to You?
Yes, thank you, Vanessa. It is What Happened to You. That's Dr. Perry and Oprah. So I'll be getting that. That'll be my next read. She does talk a lot about her trauma. She's got a lot of past abuse that's happened in her life. So I'm curious to what he's going to add into to the book. So anybody have any more questions, discussion? Let's see. Whoops. Don't mark me on my technical abilities. All right. Well, you know what? Thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's a beautiful day outside, and get out and enjoy it. If there are any questions that come up, please feel to contact any of the people that are on here today. And oh, we got some more things up here.